Hi, everyone. How are you? Welcome to our last virtual tasting of 2020. So exciting. I will give it a few more minutes to let some more people join, and then we will get started. My name is Lauren. I'll be your host for this evening. I just want to quickly thank all of you for joining us tonight while you ring in the new year, and a big thank you to those of you who have done this with us every month since we started. We've had so much fun hosting these tastings, and we look forward to enhancing this experience throughout this next year. So before we get started, go ahead and take out your truffle box if you haven't already, your tasting placemats, your pen. Also get a drink to cleanse your palate in between each piece. So this can be water, wine, beer, champagne, tea, or coffee. We would actually, if you want to fill out the poll on the screen, that way we know what you're going to be pairing with tonight. And this will help Mark cater the experience to you all, so it should be a little more interactive and fun. So I'm excited to see what everyone is pairing tonight. For those of you who have done these tastings before, you'll know how really interactive it is. So definitely take advantage of the chat box. Talk to each other about what you're tasting and what you're pairing with, and it's a great way to just get new ideas as well. And then also use the Q&A box. So that's what I'll be monitoring mostly throughout the tasting. If you have any questions about the pieces or for Mark, go ahead and type it in there, and I'll interrupt Mark throughout the tasting a little bit, and then primarily we'll save questions for the end of the tasting. That way we can kind of get through it, and everyone can try their pieces and then have a fun rest of your night. So also, don't forget to take a photo of your tasting placemat and who you're doing the tasting with, and tag us on social media at Ethel M Chocolate so we can feature you on our social media and repost you and see what everyone is doing tonight. We love seeing that and getting that little interactive part with you all, since all of your cameras and mics are off. So I'm going to quickly go over a little bit of history about our brand and company, and then I'll turn it over to Mark, who will be your chocolatier for this tasting tonight. So Ethel M Chocolates was founded by Forrest Mars Sr. in 1981. Forrest and his father Frank started the Mars Chocolate Company back in 1911, and that's actually when our original recipes date back to as well. So they worked together to create all of our favorites, so Twix, Snickers, M&M's, Skittles, Starburst, Snickers, I don't know if I said that already, but there's a ton. Those are all from Mars, which they did together. And then Forrest retired and moved to Henderson, Nevada, in search of a little bit of a warmer climate, and then also to just relax. In retirement, he got to thinking, wanted to make chocolate again, and kind of felt like you weren't really in the chocolate industry until you had your own gourmet line of boxed chocolates. So that's exactly what he did. He took his mother Ethel's recipes and started Ethel M Chocolates, and we opened in 1981. So you'll see in that top middle photo is our factory, our cactus garden, and our retail store. And you can actually see a little bit of the balcony in the top middle photo, and that is where Forrest used to live. So he lived right above the factory, and we actually still have a few rooms that are intact with his original decor. So that is pretty cool to see, and special that we kept that in honor of him. So our cactus garden, you'll see in the two photos on the right and the bottom middle photo, is 3.4 acres with over 300 species of cactus. You'll see on the right is our cacti in full bloom, which is in spring, and then the bottom is it during our holidays, which just is about to end in about 3 days. And then we will also have lights on during February. So that's our lights of love time. If you're in town during February, definitely would love for you to come out and see our garden. It's pink and purple and red lights. It's really pretty and fun to celebrate Valentine's Day that way as well. The last thing I want to touch on is our solar panel garden. So that sits right behind our cactus garden and is 4.4 acres of solar panels. And this helps to power our factory during its peak production hours. So those chocolates made during that time are all made with solar power. That's because the environment and sustainability is so important to the Mars family, which is why we are so proud to say that we can do that now. So I want to introduce Mark Mackey, who will be our chief chocolatier for tonight's tasting. He's also our senior R&D scientist here at Ethel M, which means he helps to create all of our new pieces, including the truffles that you have sitting in front of you tonight. So he graduated from the Culinary Institute of America in New York, and he's been with the Mars Company for 15 years and Ethel M specifically for 5 years now. So without further ado, I would love to hand it over to Mark.
Hey everybody, poll results came up. There we go.
Perfect. Looks like a lot of you are pairing with wine and champagne, which is awesome. And water.
Excellent. Hello everybody, my name is Mark Mackey and I'm excited to be with all of you today for our New Year's Eve truffle tasting. Hopefully you all have your boxes of delicious truffles in front of you. We'll be getting to those in just a second. But first, I want everybody to really, tonight when we're tasting our pieces, really think about slowing down. We're going to be going on a chocolate journey where we'll be using all of our senses to really just evaluate each piece of chocolate. You know, obviously taste is very important, but we also want to pay attention to our other senses. Things like touch. Is it bumpy? Is it smooth? Is it glossy? Is it matte? Aroma is very, very important. Many of you know that a lot of the tastes that you experience in your mouth and on your taste buds are actually helped by your olfactory senses up in your nose. So whenever you're sick or you might have like a stuffed up nose, you know, you typically will not, you'll feel like maybe you can't taste as well. And that's because that olfactory system is so important to what we're going to be tasting. And so with that, we want to be making sure that we're going to smell each piece, really get an idea for those aromas that are going to be in the different flavors we'll be tasting. Taste is important. Things like texture, is it smooth? Is it creamy? What kind of sensations am I feeling? Is it crunchy? Is it soft and creamy and melting quickly? Or is it melting a little slower in my mouth? And then finish. Just like a really nice glass of wine, chocolate has a beautiful finish to it. And depending on the type of chocolate used, whether it's white, milk, or dark chocolate, that finish is going to be a little bit different. Sometimes it'll be short and a little bit sweeter, and other times it'll be long and kind of lingering a little bit. Just like, again, like a Cabernet or something with a little more body might kind of stick around on your tongue, and you'll kind of taste that for several minutes after you've finished drinking or enjoying the piece. Now, if you want to take a look down at your placemat as well, you'll notice we have a section for each of the pieces that we'll be trying tonight. And then more importantly, those are the different areas where the sensory attributes that we can capture notes and things like that for each of the pieces that we'll be trying tonight. It's not an obligation, so feel free to just, it's very informal, but, feel free to capture any notes if you'd like to for each of the pieces. And then look down at the lower left-hand side, and you'll also see a wheel there that actually has a lot of the aromas and flavors, actually all of the aromas and flavors in our FLM chocolate pieces. So if you're thinking about something that you're smelling or you're tasting and maybe you can't quite put your finger on it or you can't quite like identify it, look down at that wheel because it's very likely that you'll be able to find that specific aroma or flavor in each of those different categories that we have there. And also, as Lauren mentioned, very important when we're tasting the pieces tonight, we want to cleanse our palate between each piece. And that kind of allows for us to reset and start with a baseline before we try each of those pieces. So whether you have some delicious champagne or some water, feel free to kind of rinse or cleanse your palate between each of those pieces tonight. And finally, we'll be tasting some delicious chocolate, enjoying some delicious chocolates, but also we're going to learn a little bit about the journey that the cocoa bean and cocoa pod actually take to get into those pieces that you have in front of you. So we'll taste some chocolate, we'll take a break, and we'll kind of jump back in and taste a little bit more, but that'll all give our taste buds a little bit of a chance to reset as well. But even more importantly, we all want to have fun. And, I find that by really slowing down and truly like concentrating on what you're experiencing and tasting, you can really get a lot more out of the experience. And as well, pairing in terms of beers and wines, that's completely optional. You can also pair with coffee and non-alcoholic beverages, but you'll see on the page for each piece, we'll have some different pairing options for you as well. So why don't we go ahead and jump in with the first piece. We'll start with this right here. This is our only white chocolate piece in the truffle collection that we have. This is our white chocolate vanilla truffle. So if you pick it up, the very first thing that you're gonna notice is that it's got not just that purple kind of spray on the top, but it's got a really nice kind of glossy appearance. That purple spray that's on the outside, that's actually colored cocoa butter. And so we can use that to actually create a lot of different artistic effects on our pieces. So you'll see if you look down at the other truffles, you'll see some are just one color, some are actually a couple different colors, a spritz of one and a more solid coat of another. And we actually take that colored cocoa butter and we put it into an airbrush. And we actually spray our molds with that colored cocoa butter. And so when the chocolate goes in, that sticks to the chocolate and it'll pull off onto the pieces that you see in front of you. So for this one, we just do a little bit of a spritz of a purple on the top. But the shell of this piece, this is a white chocolate shell, and the inside is a white chocolate ganache, which I'll get into in just a little bit. But why don't you go ahead and pick that piece up? And what I like to do, depending on how cool it is in your house or apartment, kind of rub the bottom a little bit, and that's going to help to start to soften the chocolate and start to activate some of those aroma compounds. And bring it up to your nose. I kind of like to cup my nose or cup my hand around my nose and just breathe in really nice and deep. And now this is a little more of it's a simpler piece, so there's not going to be a whole lot of chocolatey aromas. Being that this is white chocolate, you're going to have a lot more cream, vanilla, and dairy. Those are the primary aromas that you'll be smelling in this, but kind of like sweet cream, maybe a little bit of that vanilla as well. We'll take a bite. And with this, if you have a pairing, what I would recommend is biting the piece in half and trying it without the pairing first, kind of getting a feel for what it is and how it tastes, and then try the second bite with your pairing option. Take a bite, and you'll notice the inside almost immediately starts to melt. Give it a bite or two, and then use your tongue and kind of press it up against the roof of your mouth. And that's going to start everything melting down together. But this piece melts very, very fast. And that's because white chocolate does not contain any cocoa solids. And so because of that, the piece is going to melt a little bit slower. And I'll get into a little more detail shortly about what exactly white chocolate is. But because of that, it's going to melt very, very, very quickly. You're going to get a lot of sweet cream, some dairy notes, maybe a little bit of cooked milk or like scalded milk if you ever, heated up some milk on the stove to make hot chocolate. Maybe a slight note of caramel as well. The way that we make this piece, we actually start with white chocolate, and it's in its tempered solid form. And we're going to take that and heat up some cream just below boiling. And we're going to pour that cream over the chocolate so it all kind of melts down together, kind of comes down in temperature, melts, and it all turns into this beautiful mixture that we call a ganache. So a ganache is just a fancy word for an emulsion of chocolate and cream. And we create that ganache with that heated cream and chocolate. We're going to add a little bit of vanilla, and that's it. That's what forms the center of this white chocolate truffle. Now, to make the piece, we're going to use a process called shell molding. And when you make different chocolates, there are a couple different major processes that you can use to make chocolates. You can mold. This specifically is what we call shell molding, which means it's a little more manual, a little more labor intensive. We actually make the piece in 3 steps. The first step is to make the shell. And we do that by pouring tempered chocolate onto the mold. We're going to fill that mold completely with that chocolate. Every little cavity is going to get filled. Then it's going to bounce kind of through a little bit, and we're going to turn it upside down. And when we do that, all that white chocolate is going to fall out of the piece. And it's going to shake for a few minutes or so, and then we're going to scrape it so that all that's left in that chocolate cavity is just a very, very thin layer of white chocolate. And that's what's going to give us this really almost paper thin chocolate shell on the top there. So as soon as we bite into it, it's going to melt and really just give us that really nice truffle experience with the ganache on the inside. Once that shell that's paper thin kind of sets up, we're going to deposit the white chocolate ganache into the inside of the piece. Then that will set up, and then we're going to cover the top, or cap as we call it, with a little more tempered chocolate. And that's going to lock that white chocolate in, that white chocolate ganache into the center of the truffle. Then it just needs to set up, and then we demold into the finished piece. Excuse me. One second. All right, now in terms of pairings for this piece, white chocolate is probably one of the best options in pairing with champagne or sparkling wine. White chocolate has a lot of dairy notes, a lot of can have a little bit of fruity notes as well, but mostly dairy and cream. And so things like a Brut champagne or sparkling wine, a Cremant, which is actually very similar to champagne. It's just not made in Champagne, France, but the same style typically. That's also a delicious choice. Cava from Spain, another, or Prosecco from Italy. One of my favorites, actually, with most chocolates, but especially this one, is this Bracchetto d'Acqui. It's a lightly sparkling red wine, and it's only about 7% alcohol, but it's from Italy, and it's wonderful. It has a little effervescence to it. It's a little bit of sweetness. It has a little bit of the red fruit kind of berry quality to it that works with most all chocolates. So you'll probably see that on a lot of the slides that we'll be looking at tonight. And then also, if you don't like sparkling wine, dry whites like Chenin Blanc or Viognier are also great pairings. And on the beer side, something that's blonde, a little crisper, has a little more subtle flavor, like a Hefeweizen or a Pilsner would be great, or even like a fruit forward ale, like Magic Hat number 9. It's got a little bit of apricot flavor to it, or a Beta Purple Haze out of New Orleans. That's got it's kind of a raspberry berry type of flavor that works really nicely with the creamy notes. It's almost like a raspberries and cream experience. All right. Notice the aftertaste on this one, or the linger on this one, is pretty short. A little bit of sweetness, but not too long. Taste kind of sticks around for a little bit, and then it's gone. So think about that as we go into the next few pieces and how that will kind of change.
And
now
Mark,
I'd like to spend, yes.
Really quick, can you show that bottle again for a few seconds longer?
Sure.
They can see the exact type.
Yes, here you go. So there's a few different variety, or I guess distributors or importers of this, but all you really need to know is Bracchetto d'Acqui. This one's from Rosa Regale or Banfi. There's another one by, I think, Scent or Sola, and there are a few others that are, it just kind of depends on what part of the country you're in, I think. And another great choice, which I have here, this is a Cremant, so it's actually very similar to a champagne, but typically a little cheaper because it comes from outside of the Champagne region, but still made using the same process. So this is one from Alsace, and it's Arthur Metz Cuvée Prestige Cremant as well. All right, so now I just spent a few minutes talking to you a little bit about where chocolate comes from. So all real chocolate comes from a cocoa pod. And those pods grow on trees. They're actually the fruits of the cocoa tree. And they only grow about 20 degrees north and south of the equator. They need like a really tropical kind of humid environment in which to thrive. In our FLM beans, we get those from Ecuador, Brazil, and also West Africa. So there are a lot of different types of cocoa that are out there, and each one is going to contribute a little bit of a different flavor. One might be a little more fruity floral, one might be a little more earthy, and so creating a delicious chocolate, you really want to make sure that you have a good feel for all the flavors of those different cocoa beans. Just like a great winemaker needs to know what a Merlot or a Cabernet or a Sangiovese or, a Sauvignon Blanc grape is going to contribute to their finished blend or their finished wine. Now, as I mentioned, the cocoa pods actually grow on these cocoa trees. And something that's really interesting is that they grow not just on the branches, but actually on the trunks of the trees. You can see in the photo there. And I have actually a pod right here. This is a fresh pod from Ecuador. This is the Nacional variety of cocoa. You can see here, this one's got a little bit of red, a little brown. Depending on the variety and the region where the cocoa is growing, the cocoa will be a different color. Sometimes it'll be green, sometimes it'll be brown and orange or yellow. And so the farmer needs to know exactly what type he's growing, or the types that he's growing, so that he knows exactly when to harvest it when it's at its peak ripeness. Now, once the pods are harvested from the tree, they're going to slice those off with a blade, like a machete or some type of knife. They're going to pile those pods up, because what we want is on the inside, and that is where the cocoa beans are. So I'm going to take this pod that I have here. I don't have a machete, but I have a chef's knife. I'm just going to slice into this one to show you. That is the inside of a cocoa pod. It looks kind of gross. It definitely doesn't look like chocolate. I'll tell you, it doesn't smell like chocolate, doesn't taste like chocolate, but this is where all chocolate comes from. So those are all cocoa beans. And you notice they're covered by this kind of white pulp, right? I'm going to grab one here. It's kind of sticky and slimy, but this white pulp is very, very important to chocolate making. And the reason for that is because it's sweet. It's got a little bit of sweetness. It kind of tastes like a pineapple with a little bit of acidity, like a lychee kind of mixed in there. But this pulp is going to start to break down as soon as we open this pod. And it's going to start something called fermentation. And that fermentation is going to take about 5 to 7 days. And it's going to develop a lot of these wonderful flavors and nuances in the cocoa bean that's underneath that pulp. And all that is going to translate later down the line into delicious chocolate. And so, as I mentioned, fermentation is the next step. So the farmers are going to cut open their pods, they're going to scoop out all the beans, and they're going to pile them up on some banana leaves on kind of the floor, or sometimes it'll be in a box. Kind of depends on where they're harvesting the cocoa. But that fermentation is going to start almost immediately. It's going to, the natural yeasts in the air and the flora and fauna of the terroir is going to kind of come in and start that fermentation process. And that's going to take about 5 to 7 days. And we're going to be developing a lot of delicious flavors in those cocoa beans at this point. This is one of the most critical steps to developing or producing high quality chocolate, is the fermentation process. And you'll see the pulp kind of turns from a white color as it breaks down. It'll start to turn brown, and some heat will be generated in that process as well. But we're taking those sugars and we're transforming them or converting them into alcohol and into lactic and acetic acid in that chemical reaction process. And all while we're developing these delicious flavors in the cocoa bean. Now, once that is complete, we want to dry the beans out. We want to make sure we don't have any critters that'll get into the beans. We want to make sure they're dried perfectly for us to bring in where we're going to roast them into finished chocolate. But for now, I think we'll let them sit, kind of get a little bit of a dry there in the sun, kind of get a little bit of have a little vacation, while we jump back and taste our next chocolate piece. And this is going to be our milk chocolate truffle. So you'll notice obviously a huge color difference now from the white chocolate. Now we're going into milk chocolate. So when you pick it up and look at it, it obviously looks a lot more chocolatey. If you smell it, now you're going to smell a lot more of the aromas that you would correlate with chocolate. some roasted cocoa notes, a little more caramelized milk. But it smells a little richer. It's got a little more complexity to it. It's not just dairy. Go ahead and take a bite. And now you're gonna get, it's not gonna be just sweet. You're gonna have some roasted cocoa, a little bit of bitterness, some toasty notes. You do get a little cream and a little cooked milk, but it's not quite as strong as it was in the previous piece. And this one is also going to melt pretty quickly, or the inside, that ganache, is going to melt pretty quickly. But you'll notice the shell on the outside, that's going to take a little longer to melt. Now, milk chocolate has cocoa solids actually in it. And so because of that, it's going to kind of slow down that melting process a little bit. But really important with this piece, the center, you'll notice it's almost like mousse. It's like just melts. It's so smooth and creamy. It just melts really, really nicely. And that is coming from that ganache, or that mixture of cream and chocolate that we made in our kitchen. Now this piece, you'll notice as well, has got a different colored cocoa butter spray on the outside. This is just a copper spray, but it looks really nice. It's almost like a little piece of jewelry, or at least some of the pieces look a little bit very artistic. But it's a great way that we, or a process and technique that we use to differentiate our pieces and also add a little bit of artistic flair to each of those truffles. Now, aftertaste, you'll probably notice a little more. It's going to last a little longer. You might have a little more of that cocoa kind of remaining on your tongue. Maybe a little bit, slight note of bitterness, but definitely much longer of a finish than the previous piece. Now, if you have a glass of wine, go ahead and take a sip. And think about how the flavors are kind of changing in your mouth a little bit. With this one, again, we recommend a champagne, a cremant, or a cava, something that's a little crisper, that's going to contrast some of those dairy and the dairy notes and also the roasted cocoa notes in the milk chocolate piece. And on the beer side, blonde ale, Hefeweizen Pilsner, again, something crisp, again, to kind of contrast some of those dairy and those buttery notes. But even like a Belgian, something that's got a little more spice to it, like a Saison or a Belgian style ale. A lot of those have some fruity notes like lemon or orange, with a little bit of spice like black pepper or white pepper, that can actually add a lot of complexity to the piece. Now, some of you may even have tasted a little bit of caramel, and that's not because we're actually adding any caramel to this piece, but in that process of heating the cream to make the ganache, a lot of times you can actually caramelize slightly a little bit of that cream, and that will actually translate a bit of a caramel flavor into the finished truffle. Does anybody have any questions about that one? And again, on the sweet sparkling side, the Barchetto is a great choice, as is a Pinot Noir on the dry red side. And just for a second, I will say, you know, if you really want to pick one wine that's going to work with pretty much all chocolates, you know, the Barchetto is a great choice. But if you want just like a regular, like a dry red or something, Pinot Noir is typically going to work really well. And that's because it's more medium bodied. It's got a little more fruity, jammy, juicy notes that can really lend themselves well to most all chocolates. It's not going to be fighting for attention, but instead kind of sharing the stage with, excuse me, sharing the stage with the chocolate, which is really what's most important. You want to be able to kind of think about how the flavors are changing and evolving in your mouth with the pairing option. So Pinot Noirs are great choices, as are Chiantis as well. All right. capture any notes that you'd like to on that piece. Hard cider, I just saw that come up. That would be, I think, really awesome with any milk chocolate piece. Even white chocolate, you know, some of that apple and some of the spice notes, like the winter spices and the nutmeg and the cinnamon and mulling spices, I guess is the proper term. Those I think would work really well with with a excuse me. Oh, sorry, I got something in my mouth. Anyway, but yeah, I think those would be great choices. All right, Rodney Strong Pinot Noir. Yes, that's a great choice. All right, let's jump over to our next piece of chocolate. Rinse my palette out a little bit. And now we're gonna try our milk chocolate cinnamon pecan truffle. So very similar to the last piece, but we're gonna do things a little bit different. Instead of just creating that milk chocolate ganache, we're gonna add in some roasted pecans and some Saigon cinnamon into that ganache. So we're gonna introduce a little bit of texture into the center of the piece. So this piece, if you look at it at first, you might notice it's just kind of a red color, but if you look closely, you'll see there's some purple specks kind of throughout that piece as well. Kind of changes the color of the red a little bit, adds a little bit more depth. But it's not something that if you picked it up and held it back, you could necessarily call out maybe that specific purple color, but it really does, I think, add to the appearance of the piece. So go ahead and lift this one up to your nose, kind of rub the bottom a little bit. And you should be able to get some of that really nice Saigon cinnamon coming through. Maybe even some of those roasted pecans on the inside. Don't worry about breathing a little deep and really getting an aroma or getting a feel for the aroma. Nobody's looking at you. And then go ahead and take a bite. And you should be able to notice that kind of textural difference that you're getting now. It's not as smooth and creamy, but there's some little pieces in there. Those pecans are going to break up that ganache a little bit and actually slow down the way it melts just slightly. You get cinnamon, a little bit of bitterness. The pecans that we use for this piece, we actually caramelize them, and we use a process that's kind of similar to if you've ever, like in New York, bigger cities, you know, you'll see like on the street, sometimes they'll have little carts and they'll be caramelizing nuts. You know, they have like a copper pan, some sugar, and as that sugar heats up, it starts to kind of caramelize and actually coats the nuts. And we do something very similar in our factory to these pieces to kind of give them a little more crunch and a little more of that caramelized flavor. We also use Saigon cinnamon in this piece, which is, it's a cinnamon that actually has one of the highest levels of volatile oil. So it's very potent, and it really gives a nice floral, not just like the bite of cinnamon that you might taste with different types or like more less expensive types, but it really gives you that floral and that nice cinnamon quality without being too bitey or too harsh. Get a little bit of vanilla as well on the aftertaste with this one, as well as that cinnamon that will kind of linger with you for a few minutes. Now with this piece, if we're looking at beers, you know, really a brown ale would work really nicely. Something with a lot of roasted malt, caramelized notes would actually complement a lot of the caramel and the cinnamon and the pecan nutty notes in this piece. On the wine side, again, the Champagne, Cremant, Cava would all be great choices. Barquetto d'Aqui as well, and a Pinot Noir. You'll notice as we get into like the milk and dark chocolates, you typically want to pair less with white wine, with some exceptions. But as we move to milk and dark, typically you'll start to introduce more red wines, Pinot Noir, maybe even a Zinfandel as we get into some of the darker chocolates. And that's typically because when you pair wine and chocolate, again, you want to be sharing the stage, but also matching intensity. And so as the chocolate increases in the cocoa content and cocoa solids content, becomes a little more robust or has a little more flavor to it, you can bring up the body of the wine to kind of match that. And that's something important to keep in mind as well. All right, take a sip of your beverage, water, and you can finish up that piece while I chat with you a little bit about the last few steps of the chocolate making process. So if you last remember, we left our beans, they were kind of hanging out, relaxing, getting nicely dried out in the sun. We're going to dry those down to a final moisture content of about 7%. And that's going to be very, very important, but I'm not going to tell you why just yet. So once those beans kind of dry out, then we're going to sort them and inspect them. As I said, fermentation is so important in the development of delicious premium chocolate. We want to be able to inspect the beans and slice them in half to look at the fermentation. And we do that through this box that you see here. We'll take a sample of the beans. We're going to place them into these little nodes or little little places in cavities, I guess, in that box. That lid's going to close, and then it'll allow us to put a blade through the center of it and slice each of those beans in half. And we're going to look for an even color. We want an even distribution of brown or coloration throughout the whole bean. You'll see the beans on the left actually look consistent, right? They're nice brown throughout. But the beans on the right kind of look a little bit like medium rare steak, right? There's that very distinct difference between the outer, the exterior of the bean and the interior, that difference in red or dark red to maroon. Those beans are under fermented, and we would actually reject all of those beans. Those are not going to contribute the flavors that we're looking for in our finished chocolate. We'll let somebody else buy those beans. But this is very, very important. We want to make sure that we have that even fermentation throughout the bean. Now, once the beans pass that quality check and inspection, now they're going to be shipped to us in the United States, where we will actually roast them. And that's the second most important process step in chocolate making. Just like it takes a really nice roast to bring out all of the nuances and intricacies and different flavors and a beautiful coffee, we need to do the same thing with chocolate. And actually, the roasting process is quite similar. Just some temperature and time differences, but the actual way that you roast and a lot of the same actual equipment is used is the same for coffee and for cocoa roasting. But all those nuances and those precursors and flavors that we develop during fermentation are actually going to transform into chocolatey aromas and different complex fruity and floral notes. We're going to start to see what looks like chocolatey beans. It's going to set that wonderful dark brown color. You can see here I've got some roasted cocoa beans. I wish you all were here because I heated them up like in the microwave just a second ago. And like you can smell, I mean, it's almost intoxicating, just that wonderful roasted cocoa aroma that's coming out. But these beans, we'll roast them only for about 20 minutes. And we're developing all of those flavors. But after we roast the bean, you'll notice there is a little seam in the bean. And because we left a little bit of moisture, about 7% moisture in that bean, that moisture, when it's roasted, is going to come to the surface and it's going to kind of steam or boil off of the bean and actually crack the shell. We don't want the shell in our chocolate at all. It doesn't contribute anything to us. So that roasting process is going to really help us get that shell off. You can see I just kind of cracked it off there and threw it aside. But this is the inside of the bean. This is what we're looking for. This is the nib, what we refer to as the cocoa nib, which is just like the shell bean. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a little bit of pressure in my 2 fingers here, and you'll see how easily that bean cracks up. I just added a little bit of pressure, and it completely just kind of broke up into small little pieces. These are also called cocoa nibs, but these are really just the purest form of chocolate. You can find them sometimes online or in specialty food stores. They're called cocoa nibs or roasted nibs. And you can incorporate them into desserts, into salads. I kind of like to actually roll a little bit of goat cheese. If you have a log of goat cheese, kind of roll that in some of these roasted nibs, and it really adds a nice cocoa flavor. And they are a little bit bitter and astringent, but that's because there's no sugar in them. But they add just a really nice cocoa aroma and flavor to your dishes with just a very few number of those nibs. So something to try if you ever have a chance. Now these nibs are they're about 50% fat. In this nib, there's cocoa butter that's locked inside. And so as soon as we grind those nibs down, that cocoa butter is going to start to release and liquefy. And now we're going to start to see what looks like finished chocolate. This is when we finally will start to see and smell and taste what looks and smells and tastes like real chocolate. And we do that by grinding that down. We want to pulverize those nibs down until they're silky smooth. That cocoa butter kind of comes out and liquefies, and it's really nice and silky smooth on our tongue. Now, depending on the recipe that we're using, we will add maybe some milk, some vanilla, some sugar, all dependent on the specific recipe that we're making. But that is all determined at this point in the process. And we're going to continue to grind all those ingredients down so that they all are very uniform in texture and particle size. And then we're going to let them hang out for a few hours and allow all those flavors to kind of meld together. It's a very important process step that was actually discovered by mistake, and the process itself is called conching, and it kind of allows those flavors to kind of marinate and kind of hang out a little bit. Just like, you make a delicious soup or maybe a chili and you let it sit in your refrigerator overnight and it's even better the next day. The same thing is happening here. We're kind of rounding out those flavors and really allowing for the chocolate to show its true self and really give us everything that it has flavor-wise. So now as we do that, we're going to start to create something that looks like chocolate. It's going to smell like chocolate. It's going to taste delicious, but it's not going to quite act like chocolate. And that's because we need to do something called tempering. Tempering is essentially just a very controlled heating and cooling of the chocolate to actually force stable crystals to form in the finished chocolate. Chocolate can actually set up and has cocoa butter in it that can set up in about 6 or 7 different ways, and only one of those ways is desired for making chocolate. If you let it set up any other way, it will actually not really set up, or it'll look hazy. It might crumble in your hand or melt in your hand. It might have like an oily surface on it, and that's because it's detempered or not in temper. And what that is, if it's detempered, the cocoa butter kind of rises up through the chocolate and comes to the surface, and that's what you're seeing on the outside of the chocolate. And that's not very, very attractive. It's not very, very aesthetically pleasing. So we want to make sure that we pay very close attention to the way that we temper the chocolate so that we allow for those stable cocoa butter crystals to form. Now I'm going to step back one step here and just say, when we're grinding and mixing the chocolate, that's all for making milk or dark chocolate. If we want to make white chocolate, we're going to take these nibs and we're going to grind them just a little bit. We're just going to grind them just enough to start to release some of that cocoa butter, but it's going to maintain still a somewhat solid shape. and that'll get compressed into what we call a cocoa cake. And it's really just like some chopped nibs, a little bit of cocoa butter, but kind of compressed. And with a lot of pressure, we will press that cocoa cake, and that will release more of the cocoa butter. The cocoa butter is a little yellowish looking, and that is essentially the fat from the cocoa bean. And white chocolate only uses that component. We'll take that cocoa butter, we'll blend it with some milk, some sugar, and vanilla. And that's why it has that yellowish or more whitish appearance. It doesn't have any of the solids or the cocoa powder that are in it. So it's gonna melt a lot faster, as we experienced a little earlier. Does anybody have any questions? I know that was a lot, so.
There was a question mark about what happens to the under-fermented beans or the ones that get rejected.
Yeah, so we typically we buy our beans on contract, and so they'll come in and we'll do that inspection. And that's all. The beans, the order is contingent on the inspection. Kind of like when you buy a house, your offer is contingent on the inspection and appraisal that goes on. Same thing here. So if the beans don't pass, we basically reject them. We will try for another lot, a different supplier, a different batch of beans, but those will go back, and that supplier or broker will try to sell them to somebody else, but anybody that's making good chocolate and knows how to make good chocolate is going to be very critical and make sure those beans are inspected. So.
Mm-hmm. And then another question, John had a good question when you talked about the separation of the cocoa butter versus the solids for making white chocolate. Is that where cocoa powder comes from, or how do you get cocoa powder?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So you'll take that cocoa cake, and if you're making, it's a little bit different, but it's basically the same principle. Like you'll grind down the nibs a little bit, compress them, and the cocoa butter and the cocoa powder will separate. And depending on the amount, the compression and all those things, you can take out more or less cocoa butter. So that's why you've seen sometimes in stores, there'll be like they call it a 10 to 12% fat cocoa powder, but then there's sometimes even like a 24 to 26%. It's a little higher because they've left a little more of that cocoa butter in the powder itself. Hasn't been extracted.
Awesome. I think that was our last question on that slide. We have a few more, but I'll save those to the end.
Okay. All right, so now we will jump over to our first dark chocolate piece. This will be the one that has a purple glossy appearance to it. This is our dark chocolate truffle. So we're going to follow the same process that we did with the previous pieces, make that ganache, but in this case, we're going to use dark chocolate. Bring it up and smell. Now it's going to be much deeper, kind of darker roasted cocoa notes. You might even get a little bit of like coffee or espresso. And that's because when we roast the beans for dark chocolate, they're going to be a little darker. They're going to be a little more bitter. They may be roasted for a longer period or at a hotter temperature to bring out some of those fruity and floral nuances and some of those higher roast notes that we want in our dark chocolate. Take a bite. Kind of chew a minute, and you can press the piece up against the roof of your mouth. And you should notice a few things. The first is flavor. Not as sweet, a little more bitter, get more cocoa, more dark chocolate notes. But it's going to melt also a little bit slower. So as the shell, the ganache melts, and then the shell will start to melt, you're going to notice it sticks around with you a little longer and melts a little slower. And that's because of the cocoa solid content. Kind of breaks up that melt a little bit and slows everything down. You might get a little molasses, vanilla, even a little bit of what we call citrus blossom. So we actually add a little bit of orange oil to our dark chocolate. It's in the like parts per million, dosage. So it's not something that if you like tasted it, you'd say this tastes like orange or like citrus. But if you really search for it, it's there, and it's just a very, very small dose of that oil, that citrus oil, just to kind of set that chocolate off a little bit. It really kind of adds a little bit of complexity to it. Makes it just a little bit different. Now, again, with the linger and the aftertaste, you should notice this one's going to be even longer and stick with you for a little bit longer than even the milk chocolate pieces that we tried just before. Now, on the beverage side, with beer, porters, Irish, American stouts, things like Guinness, those are all great choices for this to kind of complement those roasted caramel notes and malt notes, complement some of the dark and rich notes in the chocolate. And on the wine side, Pinot Noir, again, is a great choice. But now we can look at things like Zinfandel, maybe Merlot, has a little more body, even maybe a Syrah, depending on the specific type. Important thing is you don't want something that's going to be too bitter that'll interfere, but instead kind of match or complement those different chocolate notes. Anybody have any questions on this one? All right. So now we'll go into our next dark chocolate piece. This is our dark chocolate desert honey truffle. So this one will start off similarly to our dark chocolate, but this time we're going to add a very important ingredient or different ingredient. That's desert honey. We actually get this from the Mojave Desert just here locally in Nevada and California. And it comes from, it's a few different types of desert, I guess, plants and flowers, but mostly fireweed is the #1, I believe, flower that, or the flower, I guess, that is used in this honey. So it has a very unique and specific flavor, but it's a little more pungent, has a little bit more complexity, and it's a little richer than a lot of the other honeys that you might try. But if you lift this piece up, you might be able to smell, I can get a little bit of it, that honey kind of coming through the chocolate a little bit. You'll see that copper spray on the outside with the colored cocoa butter, but on this piece we have a little bit of gold, like a little spritz on there to signify the desert honey on the inside. How many of you can smell the honey? I kind of close my eyes, but I can definitely get it. Take a bite. And look how really just silky smooth and fine that ganache center is. See, it melts nicely, a little different. You're gonna get that honey kind of comes in, kind of cuts a little bit of the bitterness and the roasted cocoa note, adds a little sweetness. But you'll get like a little bit in the back of your mouth, just a little bit of that honey. It's got a little bit of pungency to it. It's got a little punch. But I think it works really nicely with the chocolate and kind of holds its own against those roasted cocoa notes. Some of that vanilla as well. Something I will also say about the honey, it's actually unfiltered and unpasteurized. So, a lot of times with honey, if you get it very like a grocery store, you might find, in like the Bears or something, like a lot of that honey has typically been pasteurized and also filtered. Now, while that's great for clarity, in buying like a jar of honey, you lose some of those nuances and some of those complex flavors and things in that process. So it was really important to us to actually find that unfiltered and unpasteurized honey. So actually over time, it'll actually start to kind of solidify. So we have to heat it up every once in a while. And just before we use it in our truffle a little bit by just adding a little bit of heat to it.
So Mark, now that we're going into the dark chocolates, what percentage of dark chocolate is our chocolates kind of overall, and then these specifically?
Great question. So I'll just answer. Our dark is about 55% cacao. And if you're looking, I guess, at competitors and things, you're like, oh, it's not very high. But sometimes I think people have this idea that the higher percentage cacao, the better it is for you, or the better tasting it's going to be. And that's not always the case. Sometimes people, they can get very tricky with how they label percent cacao. It's really anything that's coming from this pod that you can label for. So if you think about it, you could have a chocolate that's little bit like lower in cocoa solids, but much higher in cocoa butter, but still increase that percentage cacao claim on your label because you've added more of the cocoa component or the cocoa butter. So when you're doing that, it's very important to look at what is your goal? What are you trying to achieve? Are you selling more solid chocolates, or are you selling chocolates that have a center with different fruits and creams and things like that? Because you want to have those in balance. And so when you're developing your chocolate recipe and choosing beans, it's not always about the percentage cacao as it is the flavors and those nuances that those beans are contributing. Because a lot of times if you make a higher percentage cacao with very specialty beans that have a very unique nuance or very strong flavor, you can actually create a chocolate that's just it's almost too much. It's just very over the top and not very palatable. And so, balancing those ingredients is very, very important. But our dark chocolate is about 55% and our milk is about 44 to 45%. The difference being mostly milk.
Right.
And has a little bit more sugar in it as well.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, let's go to my favorite piece, which is our last one of the night. This was a piece that, so we developed these new truffles. We launched them in September of this year, but this was my favorite one. This is our dark chocolate KONA espresso. You can see that really nice, beautiful copper color with that white kind of spritz. It almost looks like a little bit like outer space, maybe a little bit with stars and kind of the sky. I think it's really, really beautiful. But we use KONA coffee actually in the ganache. So we're gonna make that ganache and we're gonna make espresso using KONA coffee. KONA, Hawaii is where our coffee is grown. It's 100% KONA beans. And they're very, very unique, and they have just a beautiful character and quality to them. And they're very, very expensive as well, from trying to source. A lot of folks will do blends, 5% KONA beans and 95% something else and call it a KONA blend to get the price down. But, to get a real, 100% KONA coffee, you can really taste that wonderful, it's very smooth. It's not too bitey, but it has this really great character and floral quality to it. But we get those beans in, we steep, then we steep those beans and make that espresso. We're gonna let those ingredients kind of sit together for about an hour to an hour and a half. And then we'll strain the beans out and use that espresso ganache now to form the center of this piece. So go ahead and lift it up to your nose, and you should be able to get some of that coffee coming through a little bit. And if you don't, as soon as you bite into it, just floods your mouth with, it's not too bitter, it's just this really warm coffee espresso aroma. Then dark chocolate melts, introduces a little bit of bitterness. Chocolate and coffee are one of the best pairings. A lot of times when people are making brownies and different chocolate desserts, they'll add a little bit of coffee to the recipe. It really enhances the chocolate flavor and adds a little bit, makes it a little bit different. But you might even get some of leathery or tobacco notes, and they're not negative, but they're just in very small doses, and they really add to that complexity and really make the chocolate pretty unique and a little bit different. But those notes are typically being contributed by the KONA coffee themselves. So although it is a medium roast KONA that we use, it is roasted at a hotter temperature than the cocoa beans, and so you'll get a little more of that that earthiness that'll kind of come out. And with this one, an Irish or American stout, again, like a Guinness, are all great pairings. If you're a little more adventurous, an imperial stout or a barrel aged stout, even in like bourbon barrels, sometimes those have a lot of great qualities and earthy notes to them that can work nicely and complement this piece. As would a Pinot Noir, again, Zinfandel, Merlot, or even a late harvest Zinfandel. So that's been left on the vine a little longer, and those grapes have a little bit more residual sugar in them. And so that little bit of sweetness in the wine can actually cut a little bit of that coffee into a nice experience as well. Does anybody have any questions for anything about any of the pieces or even the process? It gets very complex and complicated, but I tried my best to kind of break it up for you guys, so it was a little not too boring to learn about it, but hopefully made that interesting for you.
So we have a few questions. Someone was wondering if there's a certain country where finer chocolates get sourced from, or is it just depending on something else?
So not necessarily. I mean, it kind of, there are 80% of the chocolate from the world, I think 75 or 80, comes from like West Africa. And that's just because, a lot of the premium or specialty beans are coming from kind of that area, but it's by no means like the only place. I mean, just like you can get great wine from many different countries, you can do the same with cocoa. And it's important to note that, there's the different varietals, just like there are with wine, there are with cocoa. But also the area where it's growing, or the terroir, the environment, those are all going to contribute different things to the chocolate. And so with us, when we're crafting our recipes, we want to use beans from different countries and different places, because they're all going to give you a little bit of a different flavor. Although single origin chocolates, as they're called, where they're coming from one specific estate or one specific area, those are really, really good. They can be very unique and different. With what we're trying to do, we have a lot of other, we have centers and we have other flavors that we're trying to pair with. And so having a blend of beans works really, really well for us. But with that said, like I said, West Africa, Brazil, Ecuador, Ghana, Indonesia, they can grow specialty beans or more expensive premium beans, but then also they have, more of the middle of the road beans that are a little less expensive that, you might use in like a candy bar or, in a cheaper convenience store product or something like that.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to take two more questions because I know it's a little over 6, so I want to respect everyone's time and talk to you a little bit about what we have coming up in this next year. So one of the questions is, what is the difference between our buttercream or our satin creams and the truffle filling? So the ganache filling.
Great question. So the satin creams or buttercreams, the process that we follow to make those pieces is essentially the process that you use to make or follow to make fudge. It's actually called kind of the fudge process. But the important difference here is that with the buttercream, we're taking cream and sugar and milk, and we're heating those ingredients up until they're about 240, 245 degrees, so above the boiling point of water. And doing that, we're creating a syrup that has like a saturated or super saturated syrup that's kind of allowing that sugar to change form a little bit. And so when it cools, it's going to be different. It's going to actually crystallize when it cools down completely. And so when we heat that up and we pour it into our cream beater, we're actually going to be crystallizing that center very specifically so that it sets up into a solid. It's almost like a delicious fudge, has that really nice soft texture, but it's got a little bit of chew to it. It's got a little bit of, it holds up a little bit more. But that's really, the difference. Whereas a ganache is just really just cream and chocolate. There is no typically other ingredients that are added. You know, in our case, we add honey. You know, we might add a little bit of vanilla, salt, you know, things like that. But just speaking specifically to the base, it's chocolate and cream. And apart from the cream being kind of boiled and heated, there's no, you know, we don't heat that up any higher. So we're not getting any of that same crystallization or cooking of sugar.
Gotcha. And then the last question was, what did you say the type of honey was that was in our honey truffle?
Yes, so it's a Mojave desert honey. So it comes from, it's a cooperative of different beekeepers and different I guess honey co-ops. But it's fireweed, I believe, is the prime. I mean, there's a few different plants and flowers that the bees are getting, you know, the pollen from, but I think fireweed is the number one or the most prevalent in flavor, I guess, in that honey.
Awesome. Thank you. So I would love to hear what all of your favorite pieces were. I know a lot of you were excited about the KONA truffle and about the cinnamon pecan truffle, but after trying them all, we would love to hear what your favorite piece was. So go ahead and answer that poll that you'll see on the screen. And also use the chat box and let us know what type of experiences, chocolate tastings you'd like to see coming up this year. I know we got a lot of questions about pairing details about bourbon or scotch, cocktails, which is something that we would love to go more into this next year. So definitely keep an eye out for that. We have some tastings in January and February coming up, and would also love for you to use our discount code virtual at ethelm.com. You will get 15% off as a thank you for joining us throughout this tasting. We had so much fun, and thank you again for joining us to start your new year.
I saw a couple questions on here. So chocolate, you'd recommend pairing with bourbon. Anything that's got caramel in it, I think, would work really nicely. Bourbon sometimes has, from the barrel, you get a little bit of that woody note or caramel note kind of coming through. Different plants that produce cinnamon varieties. Yeah, so cinnamon in the US, there's a few different types. There's cassia, which is actually not real cinnamon or Ceylon cinnamon, but there's different varieties that can be called cinnamon. So it kind of depends. And volatility, I believe they measure the essential oil content or the amount of oil, cinnamon oil in that specific cinnamon to get the level. But Saigon's great. It has really the most, I think, potent flavor while not being too bitey or astringent. Chocolate and cocktails, you know, I think really just be adventurous. Just try what you like and try different chocolates. I think it's kind of hard to go wrong. I mean, unless you pick something that's like really, really strong with like something that's a little bit, you know, more simple on the chocolate side. You know, it's, you know, but it's really what you like. I mean, I think you're going to be the best judge of that. So I'd say be adventurous and try some different combinations out. All right. What time is it? Oh, a little late. So yeah, apologize for running a little bit over, but hopefully you all learned something and had a wonderful New Year's Eve. I know this year was pretty tough for a lot of us, but hopefully 2021 is better. And I'd like to cheers all of you. So if you have a little champagne or a little glass of something, Happy New Year to all of you. Thank you all for joining us and look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you.